Have you ever felt your entire world shatter in an instant, not from an explosion, but from words that cut deeper than any blade? That's exactly what happened when my girlfriend's father, Harrison Vance, leaned across a candlelit table, his eyes burning with contempt, and snarled, "You're nothing but a street rat. Men like you should be grateful we even let you sit in this house." The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating, as 20 pairs of eyes from one of the East Coast's wealthiest families drilled into me, making me feel like nothing more than dirt. No one, not even Gemma, my girlfriend, moved to defend me. Every agonizing second of that silence felt like another knife twisting in my gut. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the street rat he was so gleefully humiliating held the fate of his entire empire in his hands. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood up, leaned close enough for only him to hear, and quietly told him, "Enjoy your steak, Harrison." Because the man he'd just insulted controlled the one thing keeping his whole world alive. The color drained from his face, but to understand how a dock worker ended up holding an old money dynasty by a thread, you have to follow me back to the beginning of the longest night of my life. The Vance family estate sat perched on a massive cliff, overlooking the churning ocean, shielded by imposing wrought iron gates and a private security detail that sized me up like I was there to pocket their priceless silverware. When Gemma and I pulled up in my trusty 5-year-old sedan, the valet hesitated, a flicker of disgust in his eyes, as if my car might contaminate the pristine row of European sports cars and luxury SUVs already lining the circular driveway. I just ignored it. I was used to it. I adjusted the collar of my off-the-rack suit, a decent number that felt like cheap paper compared to the bespoke tailoring floating around the grand foyer. The dining room itself was a monument, not just to generational wealth, but to unchecked ego. It smelled of aged Wagyu beef, rare black truffles, and a very specific kind of arrogance. The kind of wealth that doesn't just sit quietly in bank accounts, but hangs heavy in the air, daring you to breathe it in, constantly reminding you that you don't belong. Harrison Vance, a man who measured human worth strictly by bloodlines, country club memberships, and trust funds, sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. And I was just Beckett, the guy his daughter Gemma had dared to bring home 3 years ago, the anomaly, the glitch in their perfect upper crust matrix. Dinner was an endurance test from the very first poured glass of vintage champagne. We were surrounded by 20 guests, state senators, hedge fund managers, media tycoons, shipping magnates. These were people who wore wristwatches that cost more than my entire college education. Throughout the appetizers and the soup course, I kept my mouth shut. I smiled politely. I ate my dinner. I did it entirely for Gemma, who sat beside me, her thumb rubbing soothing circles into my leg under the table. A silent apology. She knew her family was toxic. She just didn't know how far they were willing to push it tonight. Her younger brother, Julian, was holding court near the center of the table. Julian, all of 28, wearing a velvet dinner jacket, was loudly bragging about a custom yacht he was commissioning for the summer in Monaco. Julian was the golden boy. He was also a staggering idiot who couldn't read a basic corporate profit and loss statement if you put a gun to his head. But in the Vance family, incompetence was happily ignored, as long as you had the right last name and knew how to order the right caviar. As the main course was served, the conversation inevitably drifted towards business. The global shipping industry was in crisis. Supply chains were a disaster, ports backed up for miles. Modern technology was rapidly taking over, and Harrison's company, Vance Marine Transport, was bleeding out. They were a stubborn dinosaur refusing to look up at the meteor. One of the senators, a man with silver hair and a booming voice, leaned forward, holding his crystal wine glass up to the chandelier light. He asked Harrison directly how the Vance empire was handling the new automation trends and predictive logistics sweeping the industry. Harrison waved his hand dismissively, his diamond cufflink catching the light. He proudly declared that technology was just a passing phase for anxious people who didn't understand how real human relationships worked. He stated with supreme confidence that real multi-million-dollar business was done on private golf courses and over expensive scotch, not on computer screens run by nerds in hoodies. I took a slow sip of my ice water. I should have kept quiet. I really should have let the old man live in his delusion. But the logistics software my company built was literally saving entire coastal ports from total gridlock at that very moment. It was my life's work. I knew the numbers intimately. So, in a moment of calm rationality, I politely offered a different perspective. I gently suggested that while relationships certainly open doors, hard data and algorithms keep those doors from slamming shut. I mentioned that optimizing freight routes through algorithmic forecasting could easily reduce overhead fuel costs by 20% in a single quarter. The entire table went dead silent. You would have thought I'd just thrown a rock through a stained glass window in a cathedral. Harrison stopped chewing his Wagyu steak. He put his heavy silver fork down very slowly. The sharp clink of the metal against the fine-boned china sounded like a gunshot echoing in the cavernous room. He turned his head and stared at me from the head of the table. His eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with an intense, burning disgust that he no longer cared to hide. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't yell. People like Harrison don't yell. They use a low, resonant tone designed to cut right through your skin and shatter your bones. He asked me, his voice dripping with condescension, exactly where I learned that fascinating piece of information. He asked if I picked it up at the docks, hauling dirty boxes in the freezing rain while the real men ran the world. Gemma tensed beside me. Her posture went rigid. She whispered her father's name as a sharp warning. But Harrison was just getting started. He had an audience of his peers, and he wasn't going to let a nobody challenge his authority. He looked around the table, making eye contact with the senators and the tycoons. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He said it was frankly adorable that I managed to read a few free articles online, but then his face hardened. He looked directly at me and reminded everyone present that I was merely a guest in a house older than my entire family tree. He stated explicitly that his family does not take strategic corporate advice from a peasant. We do not, he hissed. Let a street rat tell us how to steer a luxury ship he could never even afford to clean the decks of. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. The senators stared awkwardly at their plates. Julian smirked, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch, thoroughly enjoying the show. Clara, Gemma's mother, just looked at me with this pitiful, patronizing sigh, as if my very existence was a tragic social faux pas she was bravely enduring for her daughter's sake. My blood turned to ice. For 3 long years, I had swallowed their subtle digs. I had ignored the backhanded compliments about my background. I had smiled through the excluded family photos. I did it all because I loved Gemma. But this wasn't subtle anymore. This was a public execution of my dignity. I looked at Harrison. I stripped away the mansion, the suit, the bank accounts. I didn't see a powerful billionaire. I saw a terrified, outdated old man desperately clinging to the wheel of a rotting, sinking ship. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't raise my voice. I carefully unhooked my heavy linen napkin from my lap and placed it neatly on the table. I smoothed out the creases with my thumbs. Taking my time, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The loud scraping of the wooden legs against the marble floor echoed in the room. I looked right into Harrison's eyes, holding his gaze until he blinked. I told him in a clear, unwavering voice that he was right. I was a peasant. I built my life from nothing, with dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my brow. While he inherited his entire identity from a trust fund, he did nothing to earn. I leaned down, resting my knuckles on the table. I whispered the final words, but in that silent room, they carried perfectly. Enjoy the steak, Harrison, because it's going to be the last comfortable meal you ever have in this house. I turned around and walked out. I didn't look back at the shocked faces. I didn't care about the gasps as I walked out of those heavy oak doors into the cool night air. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had just ignited a bomb that Harrison didn't even know was resting right under his velvet chair. The freezing night air hit my face like a splash of ice water as I walked down the long, winding gravel driveway of the Vance estate. The rhythmic crunch of my shoes against the stones was the only sound breaking the unnatural silence of the massive property. My chest was tight, but my mind was remarkably clear. A familiar dark anger was bubbling up in my throat, but I was pushing it down, compressing it into fuel. I was halfway to my car when I heard the heavy mahogany front doors slam open behind me. I heard Gemma calling my name. Her voice was frantic, cutting through the wind. I stopped and turned around. She was running down the driveway, her expensive designer heels sinking dangerously into the loose gravel. Her elegant evening gown was catching the evening breeze blowing around her legs. She caught up to me, breathless, her chest heaving, her eyes shining with thick, unshed tears under the dim glow of the estate security lights. I stiffened my jaw. I looked at her and told her firmly that she didn't need to apologize for him. I told her I was done. I was finished being the designated punching bag for her family's fragile egos. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't try to play peacemaker. Instead, she threw her arms around my neck, crashing into my chest and buried her face in my shoulder. She was shaking. She whispered fiercely that she wasn't apologizing for them. She was leaving them. She said she was so sickened and disgusted by what had just happened that she could hardly pull air into her lungs. She pulled back, looked me right in the eyes, and told me to take her home. Her home. Away from all of this. I wrapped my arms around her and held her tight against the cold. In that single defining moment, the very last tether holding my restraint back snapped. Gemma was officially out. She had drawn her line in the sand, and she had chosen my side. That meant I no longer had to play nice. The gloves were off and the war was on. Driving back to the city center, the silence in the car was incredibly heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the heavy, loaded silence of a dam right before the concrete cracks and the water rushes through. My mind started drifting back over the last 3 years of our relationship. A highlight reel of humiliation played on a loop in my head. A dark museum of pain that I had carefully curated, endured, and locked away for Gemma's sake. Let's walk through the exhibits. Exhibit A, our very first Thanksgiving. I vividly remembered walking into their massive, over-decorated dining room holding a rare, expensive bottle of Barolo. I had saved up for 3 solid months just to buy it, eating cheap noodles so I could afford something worthy of her father's cellar. I was nervous, sweating in my suit. I desperately wanted to impress them. When it was time to sit down for the meal, Harrison had loudly directed the entire extended family, all the aunts, uncles, and wealthy cousins, to the main dining table. But when I pulled out an empty chair next to Gemma, Clara, her mother, physically stepped in front of me with a sweet, sugary, venomous smile. Clara told me that the main table was strictly for immediate family and distinguished guests only. She pointed her manicured finger to a small, wobbly folding table set up near the swinging kitchen doors. The kids' table. I was 32 years old at the time, an adult man building a company, sitting on a hard plastic chair next to a 9-year-old cousin who was throwing peas, eating dry turkey, while the adults laughed, clinked crystal glasses, and ignored me 20 feet away. Gemma had tried to move and sit with me, but Harrison had threatened to cause a massive scene and ruin the holiday. So I stayed. I swallowed my pride and ate the humiliation. Exhibit B, the stolen presentation. About a year later, Julian had shown up unannounced at my cramped apartment one evening, pretending to be deeply stressed and vulnerable. He played the humble little brother routine perfectly. He said he was struggling with a complex logistics proposal for a new port acquisition the family company was eyeing. He'd begged for my expertise. I spent 4 exhausting hours that night walking him through a modernized supply chain algorithm I had developed. I gave him my handwritten notes. I gave him my printed data sets. I thought I was helping family. 2 weeks later, Gemma called me absolutely furious and crying. Julian had presented my exact model, down to the decimal points, to the Vance Marine Board of Directors. He claimed he had spent months developing the brilliant system himself. When I confronted him later in the parking lot of his country club, he didn't even look guilty. He just laughed. He patted my shoulder firmly and said, "Nobody on a billionaire board would ever believe a tech nobody over a Vance family member." Anyway, he smiled and told me to consider the stolen work my rent for being allowed to date his sister. Exhibit C, the birthday gift. For Harrison's 60th birthday extravaganza, I spent 3 weeks tracking down a specific vintage bottle of Barolo from his birth year. It was incredibly rare, cost me significantly more than my monthly rent. I handed it to him personally at the catered party. He looked at the faded label, looked at my cheap shoes, and sighed heavily. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even smile. He turned, handed the priceless bottle to a passing waiter, and loudly instructed the man to use it for the cooking wine in the kitchen, because it probably wasn't fit to drink. Later that night, while walking to my car, I saw the empty bottle lying in the garbage can behind the caterer's tent. It was never about the wine. It was about sending a clear, undeniable message. Nothing I created, nothing I offered, and nothing I was would ever have value in their world. I gripped the leather steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The contrast was almost laughable now. They looked at my calloused hands and assumed I was broken. They saw my practical 5-year-old watch and assumed I was poor and uneducated. They didn't know about the brutal late nights I spent down at the frozen docks, learning every single fatal flaw in the global shipping network. They didn't know that while Julian was snorting his generous allowance in VIP nightclubs, I was writing thousands of lines of code in a tiny studio, building a predictive software that would eventually revolutionize the entire maritime industry. They looked at me and only saw the peasant. They were entirely blind to the empire I had quietly built in the shadows. We finally pulled into the underground parking garage of our downtown building. Gemma unbuckled her seatbelt and reached over to squeeze my hand before we got out. She looked exhausted but resolute. She told me she loved me and she promised that we never had to see any of them ever again. I smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile. I kissed the back of her hand and told her I loved her too. But as we walked towards the elevator banks, my mind was already racing miles ahead. She was right, we might not ever have to see them as family again. But Harrison Vance and I were about to get very intimately, dangerously acquainted in the ruthless world of corporate business. We got back to our apartment just past 10 at night. The city below was humming, a constant stream of headlights and sirens. But inside our walls, the air was heavy with exhaustion. Gemma was emotionally drained. The psychological toll of finally cutting the cord with your own flesh and blood, of realizing they are beyond saving, is monumental. She didn't say much. She walked straight to the bedroom, changed into one of my oversized gray hoodies, and fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. I felt a fierce protective instinct flare up in my chest. Then I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and stepped out onto the balcony. The city skyline stretched out before me, a massive electric grid of millions of people fighting tooth and nail for their piece of the pie. I loved this city. It was brutal and unforgiving, but it was honest. It didn't care about your last name or who your grandfather played golf with. It only cared about what you could build with your own two hands. It was exactly 11 p.m. when my personal phone buzzed on the kitchen island. The vibration rattled loudly against the marble counter. I walked inside and picked it up. The screen flashed the name, Fiona. Fiona was my chief operating officer, my right hand, and the sharpest mind I had ever encountered. She was brilliant, relentlessly ruthless, and I was fairly certain she never actually slept. I answered the phone, staring out at the city lights. I asked her plainly what was burning down at this hour. She didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She never did. She said we had an urgent, rapidly escalating situation regarding the Vanguard acquisition. Vanguard. That was the internal code name we used for Harrison's failing company, Vance Marine Transport. Here's the massive, multi-billion-dollar secret I had been keeping from Gemma, from Harrison, from the media, from everyone. 5 years ago, working out of a rented garage, I launched a tech startup focused heavily on artificial intelligence and predictive logistics. It took off faster than anyone, including myself, ever expected. Within 3 short years, we had massive capital backing. We began quietly acquiring struggling, outdated supply chain companies, aggressively stripping away their bloated, incompetent management and injecting our proprietary tech to make them wildly profitable. To avoid the relentless media circus and the scrutiny that comes with rapid wealth, I structured my ownership behind a complex series of blind trusts and holding companies. The main parent entity, the one that controlled everything, was called Aegis Holdings. I was the sole 100% owner. Nobody in the old money shipping world knew my face. I was a ghost in the financial sector, and Vance Marine Transport was failing miserably. Harrison's stubborn refusal to modernize, combined with Julian's reckless spending, had run the proud family legacy straight into a solid brick wall. They were currently sitting on a staggering $1, $2 billion of toxic, unmanageable debt. The massive corporate banks were circling the waters like starved vultures. Their only possible way out, their only hope to avoid total bankruptcy, was to find a massive buyer to inject emergency capital and take over daily operations. For the last 3 agonizing months, Harrison Vance had been practically begging Aegis Holdings for a buyout. He was truly desperate. He was willing to sell 49% of his company just to secure the cash and miraculously keep his title as chairman to save his precious social status. He thought Aegis Holdings was just a faceless foreign corporate entity willing to bail out a historic brand. Fiona's voice was tight and clipped over the phone. She said, Vance Marine's legal team just pushed an urgent, desperate request through our secure portal. They want to expedite the signing of the letter of intent. They're entirely out of cash. If they don't get a $50 million advance from Aegis by Wednesday afternoon, they're going to default on a massive international loan. If that happens, the Port Authority is going to legally impound their entire commercial fleet. I stared out the window at the dark water of the harbor in the distance. The irony of the situation was so thick, you could choke on it. Less than 3 hours ago, Harrison Vance had looked me dead in the eye in front of 20 powerful people and called me a street rat. He told me I had no place in his elevated world, and right at this very second, his expensive lawyers were begging my hidden company to save him from total humiliating ruin. Fiona paused, waiting for my directive. She asked if we should proceed with the scheduled terms and lock them into the acquisition as planned. I took a deep, slow breath. Before tonight, before that dinner, this was strictly business. It was a cold, calculated, strategic move to acquire valuable market share and port access. I was even planning to be generous. I was going to let Harrison keep a ceremonial role on the board with a nice salary just to save Gemma from the endless family drama. But Gemma was out, and Harrison had shown me exactly who he was. I spoke into the phone. I told Fiona no. There was a heavy pause on the line. Fiona was rarely surprised by my decisions, but I clearly heard the sudden shift in her breathing. She spoke carefully, reminding me that this was a highly lucrative deal. The assets alone were worth the price. She warned me that if we pulled out of the negotiations now, Vance Marine would officially collapse into receivership by the end of the week. I told her, my voice dangerously calm, that I didn't want to pull out. I wanted to alter the deal. I instructed her to draft an entirely new contract by morning. Not a partnership agreement, not a friendly merger. A hostile takeover disguised as a desperately needed bailout. I told her to bury a brutal forced liquidation clause deep in the financial covenanters. I wanted it written so that if they missed one single performance metric, and with Julian's accounting, they absolutely would we possess the immediate legal right to seize all physical assets, dissolve the executive board, and fire the CEO with zero severance and zero legal recourse. Fiona was quiet for a long moment. Then I heard the rapid, sharp clicking of her mechanical keyboard. She asked, her tone shifting, if something specific happened at the family dinner tonight. I told her, Harrison called me a peasant. Fiona stopped typing immediately. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped an entire octave. It was the cold, clinical voice she only used when we were going to corporate war. She told me she would have the new, lethal paperwork drafted by 6 in the morning. She promised me she was going to make the contract entirely bulletproof. I hung up the phone and stood alone in the dark living room. I was no longer just going to beat Harrison in the market. I was going to systematically dismantle the very foundation of his arrogance. I was going to hand him the pen and let him sign his own professional death warrant. He thought he was the apex predator, but tonight he was just bait, and I was starving. Monday morning hit me like a runaway freight train. I was wide awake by 5, standing in the quiet of my kitchen, brewing a pot of strong, dark roast coffee. The city outside was still wrapped in the gray, pre-dawn light. Gemma was still asleep in the bedroom, her breathing deep and even, clearly exhausted from the intense emotional hangover of the weekend. I quietly walked in, kissed her forehead softly so I wouldn't wake her, grabbed my laptop from the counter, and headed straight to my home office. I had an entire corporate empire to dismantle today, and I needed an early start. By 7, the sun was finally rising over the glass skyscrapers of the city, casting long shadows across my desk. My professional inbox was already flooded with the usual daily crisis reports, but there was one specific email that made my blood run instantly cold. It wasn't from Fiona or my legal team. It was from an old trusted industry contact, a guy who ran a highly successful mid-sized freight forwarding company that relied heavily on my logistics software. The subject line of his email was simple and alarming. Is any of this true? Attached to the email was a high-resolution screenshot taken from an elite, invite-only digital forum used exclusively by top-tier shipping executives and wealthy investors. There was essentially a tight-knit digital country club where rumors could destroy a business overnight. And sitting right at the very top of the daily trending feed was a long, unhinged post written by none other than Julian Vance. My eyes scanned the text rapidly. Julian had not just thrown a childish tantrum online. He had launched a highly calculated, incredibly malicious smear campaign against me. He explicitly named my front-facing software development company. He brazenly claimed that our predictive algorithms, the core of our business, were entirely fabricated. He stated, citing his supposed insider industry expertise and family legacy, that our data was rigged, Our client success results were artificially inflated, and doing business with our firm was a massive cybersecurity risk that could ruin a company. He even threw in a nasty personal jab about the founder being a low-level, uneducated scam artist desperately trying to infiltrate high society. He didn't use my actual name in the post, but in our highly specialized niche industry, he didn't have to. Everyone knew who ran that specific software firm. It was a direct, targeted strike at my professional reputation. My phone rang loudly, breaking the silence of the room. It was the partner who had sent the email. I picked it up and he sounded incredibly nervous, almost frantic. He babbled that he knew Julian was a spoiled loudmouth who liked to hear himself talk, but the Vance family name still held significant weight with the older investors. He asked me directly, his voice trembling slightly, if there was any truth at all to the data inflation claims, because his own board of directors was getting very jittery and threatening to pull our software from their operations. I spent 10 solid minutes calmly talking him off the ledge, firmly assuring him that our third-party audits were public, transparent, and entirely flawless. When I finally managed to hang up the phone, I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and stared up at the ceiling, letting out a long breath. This was classic Julian. He was terrified. He saw my absolute lack of reaction at the dinner table on Saturday night, not his submission, but his quiet strength. And weak, insecure men absolutely cannot stand the sight of quiet strength in someone they deem inferior. He desperately needed to drag me down into the mud to make himself feel taller. He didn't know about my ownership of Vega's holdings, of course. He just genuinely thought he was effortlessly crushing a small-time tech vendor who dared to talk back to his powerful father. But he had just crossed a massive red line. Disrespecting me at a private dinner party was one thing. I could handle insults. But threatening my company, publicly threatening the hard-earned livelihoods of the hundreds of employees who depended on me with completely baseless lies, that was entirely unforgivable. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building my credibility from the ground up. In the tech and logistics world, trust is your only real currency. Once a vicious rumor like that gains traction among the elite circles, it can quickly cost millions of dollars in lost contracts, even if it's eventually proven to be entirely false. Julian was recklessly playing with matches in a room completely filled with gasoline, totally blind to the fact that he was the one standing there covered in fuel. My office door creaked open, and then my phone buzzed again with a text. Gemma was awake. She walked slowly into the office holding a warm mug of herbal tea, her hair still messy from sleep. She took one look at my face and stopped dead in her tracks. She asked, her voice filled with concern, "What's wrong?" I sighed, turned my laptop screen around so she could see it clearly, and pointed to the screenshot. She read the post, her eyes widening with every line. Her hands started to shake, rattling the ceramic teacup loudly against the saucer. She whispered, her voice trembling with rage, "I'm going to kill him." She immediately reached into her pocket for her phone, saying she was going to call Julian right this second and threaten him with a massive defamation lawsuit if he didn't take it down. I stood up, reached out, and gently covered her shaking hand with mine. I carefully took her phone away and set it on the desk. I looked down into her angry eyes and told her firmly not to call him. I told her not to say a single word to anyone in her family. She looked at me confused and deeply frustrated. She asked why on earth I was letting him get away with destroying my reputation. I pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. I told her, my voice dropping lower, that I was not letting him get away with anything. I carefully explained that if we threatened the standard lawsuit right now, Julian would simply panic, delete the post, and hide behind his father's expensive army of corporate lawyers. He would learn absolutely nothing. He would suffer no real consequences. I looked her dead in the eye and told her, I don't want an apology from him. I want his entire world to burn down to the foundation. I told her to go to work, act completely normal, and trust me to handle this my way. She looked deeply into my eyes for a long moment. She saw the cold, calculated anger burning there. She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what I was planning. She said she trusted me. When the front door closed and she left the apartment for her office, I picked up my phone and immediately dialed Fiona. The plan was no longer just about taking over Vance Marine Transport to secure a port. It was about absolute, surgical destruction. Julian wanted to play dirty corporate warfare? Fine. But I wasn't bringing a gun to a knife fight. I was bringing a nuclear warhead. By 9 in the morning, my downtown office suite felt less like a corporate workspace and more like a military war room preparing for a major offensive. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the main conference room overlooked the busy harbor where massive cargo ships moved like slow, lumbering steel beasts in the distance. Fiona was already sitting at the head of the massive oak table, surrounded by towering stacks of financial documents, legal briefs, and printed spreadsheets. She looked up as I walked in, immediately sliding a fresh, steaming cup of black coffee across the polished wood toward me. She pushed her glasses up her nose and stated flatly that we had a massive amount of work to execute if we wanted to close the trap by tomorrow morning. I sat down heavily in my chair, unbuttoning my cuffs and rolling up my sleeves. Before we got to the contracts, I told her in detail about Julian's defamatory post on the executive forum. Fiona didn't blink. She didn't express outrage. She just tapped something quickly into her digital tablet. She calmly said she would have our internal legal team permanently archive the post illegally, track the IP address to prove it came from his device, and begin preparing a massive civil defamation suit that would personally bankrupt Julian for the rest of his natural life. She noted dryly that we would keep that lawsuit securely in our back pocket for dessert. Right now, she said, tapping the thick stack of papers, we had a main course to prepare. I nodded in agreement. We needed serious leverage to pull this off. Real, undeniable leverage. The $1 dollars, $2 billion corporate debt they owed the banks was good. But it was just corporate debt. Rich men escape corporate debt all the time through bankruptcy loopholes. I needed something that tied Harrison's hands completely and personally. Something criminal. I told Fiona to get Desmond on a secure encrypted line right now. Desmond was an independent board member at Vance Marine. He was a tough, old-school shipping veteran, a guy who actually knew how a physical port operated, unlike the Vances who only knew how to read balance sheets. Over the past year, he and I had formed a quiet, highly effective back-channel alliance. He deeply respected my technological solutions, and I respected his decades of grounded operational knowledge. More importantly, Desmond was utterly disgusted by Harrison's arrogant mismanagement and furious about Julian's reckless, unchecked spending that was destroying the company. He was the one who had initially subtly steered Harrison towards seeking a bailout from Aegis Holdings, completely unaware that I was the actual owner. He was my invaluable inside man. Fiona tapped the speakerphone button on the console. The secure line clicked twice, and Desmond's deep, gravelly voice filled the quiet room. He skipped the hellos. He asked immediately if we were ready to pull the trigger on the acquisition, because the Vance ship was taking on water fast and sinking rapidly. I leaned closer to the microphone. I asked him directly to tell me exactly how desperate Harrison was feeling this morning. Desmond let out a dry, bitter laugh that sounded like sandpaper. He said Harrison was sweating bullets and pacing the floors. The major lending bank had just called an emergency restructuring meeting for Thursday. If the Aegis cash injection deal wasn't signed and finalized by tomorrow, the bank was going to legally freeze all of Vance Marine's operating accounts. Desmond stated grimly that the company would miss payroll for thousands of workers by Friday. It would be an absolute bloodbath in the press and the markets. I paused, thinking carefully. I asked Desmond if there was anything else hidden in the shadows. I asked if there was anything Harrison was desperately hiding from the official audited ledger. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint scratch of Desmond lighting a cigar on the other end. Taking his time, he finally spoke, his voice lower. He said he really shouldn't be telling me this because if it leaked the wrong way, it could easily land him and half the board in federal prison for complicity. I told him firmly that I owned the leak. I promised him absolute protection. I told him to speak. Desmond dropped the hammer. He revealed a dirty secret. He said Harrison had not just been stupidly mismanaging the corporate funds. He had been actively, intentionally cooking the books for years. For the last 2 fiscal years, Harrison had been systematically reclassifying massive personal family expenses as corporate logistics and maintenance costs to artificially inflate the company's valuation and hide their massive debt ratio from the auditors. We were talking about millions of dollars siphoned off for Julian's private yachts, Clara's lavish charity galas, and massive unapproved architectural renovations to their private estate. It was not just bad business, it was millions of dollars of outright undeniable corporate fraud. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was exactly what I needed. This was the ultimate kill shot. I asked Desmond, my voice completely steady, if he had actual hard proof of these transactions. He exhaled a cloud of smoke I could practically hear. He said he had kept a secondary, hidden ledger locked securely in a private safe deposit box. He had been quietly compiling it for a year as a personal insurance policy against Harrison's inevitable downfall. I told him I needed that drive in my hands today. Before noon, I promised him that when the dust finally settled and the Vances were gone, he would be officially named the new CEO of the fully restructured Vance Murray. He would finally get to run the company the right way, without the parasitic family draining the accounts. Desmond agreed without hesitation. He said he would personally courier the encrypted flash drive to Fiona within the hour. We ended the call. Fiona looked up at me, a rare, genuinely terrifying grin spreading across her sharp features. She pushed her glasses up again and stated simply that documented fraud changes the entire game. I told her to rip up the standard bailout agreement we had prepared yesterday. We were rewriting the terms from scratch. For the next 4 intense hours, we built a flawless, inescapable legal spiderweb. We drafted a massive M&A contract that looked completely standard and boring on the surface, but was secretly laced with lethal poison pills. We buried Clause 4B deep in the text, which stipulated that Aegis Holdings assumed all physical assets, but absolutely zero personal legal liabilities of the former executive board members. Then we crafted Clause 7C, the ultimate forced liquidation trigger. It explicitly stated that if any financial irregularities or fraudulent classifications were discovered post-signing, the current chairman and entire executive team would be immediately terminated with cause, forfeiting all shares, all severance packages, and all legal protections against prosecution. We meticulously buried these explosive clauses under hundreds of pages of dense, mind-numbing legal jargon. Harrison's lawyers were so panicked, so incredibly rushed to get the cash advance before the bank deadline, I knew they would never have the time to properly vet page 4/2012. They would just flip to the back and frantically look for the signature line. Fiona hit print. The massive stack of paper eventually landed on the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. She looked at me, tapping the thick document. She said the trap was set and armed. All the mouse had to do now was take the cheese. I looked down at the contract. It was not just paper and ink. It was pure justice. The late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows right across my office floor when the ultimate staggering irony of the entire situation played out right in front of my eyes. I was sitting quietly at my desk, the 2 large monitors glowing brightly in front of me. The split screen I had set up was a modern masterpiece of poetic justice, and I was the only one in the world who could see the full picture. On the left monitor was my highly secure encrypted Aegis Holdings corporate email server. Right at the very top of the VIP inbox was an urgent, flagged message directly from Harrison Vance's private address. I clicked it open and read it slowly. It was a masterclass in pathetic corporate groveling. Harrison, writing formally to the esteemed managing director of Aegis, was practically begging on his knees. He wrote eloquently that the Vance family was deeply honored and humbled to partner with a visionary, forward-thinking institution like Aegis. He generously used buzzwords like synergy, legacy, and mutual global prosperity. But buried just under the thick layer of corporate speak was pure, unadulterated desperation. He was formally requesting a $50 million advance on the acquisition funds, pleading for it to be wired by tomorrow afternoon at the latest, casually citing minor cash flow restructuring needs. He was desperately begging a faceless, unknown entity to save him from completely drowning in his own incompetence. Right as I finished reading the email, my personal cell phone buzzed violently on the wooden desk. I picked it up. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I knew exactly who it was the second I saw the first word. The message read, "Beckett, this is Harrison Vance. Do not think for 1 second that your little disrespectful stunt at my dinner table went unnoticed. You are a peasant, playing a dangerous game in a world you do not understand. Stay away from my daughter. You will never ever belong in our world. If you ever disrespect my family again, I will personally crush you." I sat perfectly still, holding the glowing phone in one hand and reading the pleading email on the large screen with the other. The contrast was absolutely staggering. It was almost hard to comprehend. Here was a man so entirely blinded by his own inherited superiority, so wrapped up in his false sense of power, that he could not see the massive reality of his own imminent destruction. He was simultaneously playing the role of the ruthless, untouchable billionaire threatening a peasant, while simultaneously playing the role of the pathetic, broke old man begging a total stranger for a financial bailout to keep the lights on. He genuinely thought he was untouchable. He believed his family bloodline magically shielded him from the consequences of his actions. He had absolutely no idea that the esteemed managing director he was begging for millions of dollars, and the peasant he was threatening to crush into the dirt, were the exact same person, sitting in the exact same chair. I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of the man was breathtaking. I did not reply to the angry text message. Silence is always louder and more intimidating than anger. Let him think I was cowed and intimidated. Let him think his arrogant threat landed perfectly. It would only make his inevitable fall tomorrow morning that much steeper and that much more painful. Instead, I turned my attention back to my keyboard. I slowly drafted a reply from the secure Aegis server directly to Harrison's email. I kept the tone brief, highly professional, and entirely devoid of any human emotion. Mr. Vance, Aegis Holdings acknowledges your urgent request for expedited funding. We have fully finalized the acquisition documents and the capital is prepared. Our lead representative will be at your corporate headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 cells, sharp to execute the contracts in person. Ensure your entire executive board is present for the signing. The funds will be released immediately upon signature. I reviewed the words one last time, ensuring there was no hint of what was coming. Then I hit send. 30 seconds later, the Aegis inbox chimed brightly. Harrison had replied almost instantly, showing exactly how closely he was watching his screen. We will be ready. Thank you for your incredible partnership and faith in our legacy. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let out a long, slow breath. The adrenaline was really starting to course through my veins now. 3 long years of biting my tongue to the point of bleeding. 3 years of watching Gemma cry quietly because she felt she was never good enough for their impossible, moving standards. The Thanksgiving table incident, the blatantly stolen presentation, the countless sneers, the whispers behind my back, the calculated insults. It was all culminating in a single meeting room tomorrow morning. Fiona walked into the office, holding her long coat over her arm, preparing to leave for the night. She stopped and looked at the screens, reading both the angry text message on my phone and the desperate email thread on the monitor. She let out a low, impressed whistle. She asked me, raising an eyebrow, if I was truly ready for the chaos tomorrow. She warned me that cornered animals, especially rich ones, tend to bite hard when they realize they're trapped. I looked at the city lights beginning to flicker to life outside the massive window. Reflecting on the dark glass, I told her softly that I wasn't worried about his bite. I told her his teeth were already gone. He just didn't know it yet. I packed up my heavy leather briefcase. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been enthusiastically taken. Tomorrow morning, I was walking right into the lion's den, but I wasn't walking in as prey. I was walking in as the new owner of the entire zoo. Tuesday morning arrived with a clear, crisp blue sky, the kind of sky that makes you feel like anything is possible if you just reach high enough. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't put on a soap tie or polish a pair of expensive Italian loafers. Instead, I put on a pair of dark tailored trousers and a simple, high-quality white button-down shirt. I deliberately left the collar open and rolled the sleeves up precisely to my forearms. I wanted to look comfortable. I wanted to look like a man who was getting ready to do some heavy lifting. When you hold all the cards, you don't need to dress up to impress anyone. The power is in the silence, not the fabric. I met Fiona and Desmond in the expansive, echoing marble lobby of the Vance Marine Transport corporate headquarters. The building was a towering monolith of glass and steel right in the heart of the financial district. It was an intimidating structure, designed specifically to make anyone who walked through the front doors feel small and insignificant. A massive bronze globe sat in the center of the lobby, surrounded by security guards in sharp uniforms. Desmond was wearing his usual dark, conservative suit, looking every bit the seasoned corporate veteran. Fiona was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray pantsuit, holding her sleek leather briefcase like a weapon ready to be drawn. We didn't speak as we walked toward the private executive elevator bank. We didn't need to. The plan was locked in. The contract was finalized. The only thing left to do was execute the maneuver. Desmond swiped his black executive access card over the glowing scanner. The heavy chrome doors of the elevator slid open silently. We stepped inside. As the elevator shot upward toward the penthouse boardroom on the 60th floor, my stomach tightened, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was pure, highly concentrated anticipation. Every slight ding of the floors passing by was a countdown to the destruction of Harrison Vance's ego. When the doors finally opened on the top floor, the atmosphere was completely different. The air up here smelled of expensive cologne, fresh-cut lilies, and desperate anxiety. We walked down the thick, plush carpet of the hallway toward the massive frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. Through the glass, I could see the blurry silhouettes of the men inside. I pushed the heavy door open and walked in first. The boardroom was spectacular. A 50-foot-long table made of rare imported mahogany dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline and the bustling harbor below. Harrison Vance was standing at the head of the table. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly combed, but up close the illusion of power cracked. I could see a faint sheen of nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. He was gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He was a man staring over the edge of a cliff, desperately waiting for a net to catch him. Julian was sitting casually halfway down the table, entirely unbothered. He was leaning back in his plush leather chair, tapping away on his phone, likely checking the very forum where he had tried to destroy my reputation just 24 hours earlier. When the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, Harrison snapped his head up, expecting to see the savior from Aegis Holdings. Instead, he saw the peasant. For a full 3 seconds, absolute stunned silence filled the massive room. Harrison's brain simply could not process what he was seeing. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from my rolled-up sleeves to my face. Then the confusion violently morphed into explosive red-hot anger. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He slammed his flat palm down on the mahogany table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He demanded, his voice shaking with pure rage, to know exactly how I had gotten past security. He asked me what the hell I thought I was doing crashing the most important meeting of his life. Julian looked up from his phone, a nasty, condescending smirk instantly spreading across his face. He chuckled a cruel, mocking sound. Julian told his father to relax. He looked at me and arrogantly stated that I must have finally realized how badly I messed up at the dinner. Julian assumed I was there to grovel. He told me that Gemma wasn't there, and that I couldn't just beg my way back into the family by crashing their corporate headquarters. Harrison didn't even listen to his son. He reached a shaking hand toward the sleek black intercom phone sitting on the center of the table. He snarled that he was calling the police and having me arrested for trespassing. He told me I was nothing but a pathetic street rat and I was about to be thrown out in handcuffs. Before his fingers could even touch the plastic receiver of the phone, Desmond stepped smoothly out from behind me into the bright light of the room. Desmond put his hand firmly over the telephone. He looked directly at Harrison, his expression completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. Desmond told Harrison to put the phone down. He said there was absolutely no need to call security. Harrison froze, his hand hovering over the intercom. He looked at Desmond, deeply confused by the betrayal. He asked Desmond what on earth he was doing and why he brought this nobody into the secure boardroom. Desmond slowly pulled out the thick-bound stack of the Aegis Holdings acquisition contracts from Fiona's briefcase and placed them gently onto the polished table. He smoothed his hand over the cover page. Then Desmond turned his head and looked at me. He gestured toward me with an open palm. Desmond looked back at Harrison and delivered the line that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life. He spoke slowly, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. Harrison, I would like to formally introduce you to the chairman, sole owner, and chief executive officer of Aegis Holdings. Desmond paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. The young man you just called a street rat is the man who owns the ink you are about to sign your life away with. How exactly does a billionaire react when he realizes he just handed the keys to his entire kingdom to the man he despised the most? The silence that slammed into the boardroom was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating physical weight. It was the kind of absolute silence that happens right after a bomb goes off, before the dust even begins to settle. Harrison Vance did not move. He did not breathe. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of gray. His jaw actually dropped open slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a terrifying alien creature right in front of his eyes. Julian dropped his very expensive phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen instantly shattering. But Julian didn't even flinch or look down. His arrogant smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. I did not say a word. I did not gloat. I simply walked slowly past them, moving with absolute deliberate purpose. I bypassed the guest chairs and walked straight to the massive high-backed leather chair at the very head of the table. Harrison's chair. The seat of power for the Vance family for over 3 generations. I pulled the chair back and sat down. I leaned back comfortably, resting my forearms on the armrests, interlacing my fingers. I looked down the length of the table at the 2 men who had tormented me for years. I nodded to Fiona. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, and dropped a massive, heavy black binder directly onto the table in front of Harrison. The thud made him physically jump. I leaned forward, my voice slow, calm, and completely devoid of any warmth. I told him we didn't have much time. The bank deadline was approaching in exactly 50 minutes. I told him we needed to review the exact numbers that brought us to this table. I opened my own copy of the file. I didn't look at him. I looked at the data. The numbers were my weapons, and I was about to use them surgically. I read the first figure out loud. 1 W. 2 billion. I let the massive number hang in the air. I explained that this was the total amount of toxic, unrecoverable debt his stubborn refusal to modernize had saddled this historic company with. It was a staggering failure of leadership. I flipped the page. The paper rasped loudly in the quiet room. Next, I read the second figure, 45 million stas. I looked up and locked eyes with Julian, who was now visibly trembling in his seat. I told the room that $45 million was the exact amount of corporate funds Julian had actively embezzled and hidden under the guise of logistics research and development. I detailed how that money had magically transformed into a custom yacht in Monaco, a fleet of Italian sports cars, and an absurd, lavish lifestyle he did absolutely nothing to earn. Julian opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to make an excuse, but no words came out. He just let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. I turned back to the ledger and flipped to the final, most damning page. I read the last figure, 1,200. I looked at Harrison. The man was practically shrinking into his expensive suit. I told him 1,200 was the number of hard-working, loyal port workers whose pension funds he had quietly slashed and diverted over the last 2 years just to keep the lights on in his own mansion. 1,200 families whose futures he had stolen just so he could maintain the illusion of being a successful billionaire. Harrison finally found his voice. It was not the booming, arrogant baritone from the dinner table. It was a weak, wet, pathetic rasp. He gripped the edge of the table, his hands shaking violently. He stammered that I couldn't do this. He said this was illegal. He claimed I was blackmailing him. He reached a trembling hand out, grabbing the thick acquisition contract Fiona had set down. He yelled, a sudden burst of panicked adrenaline hitting him, that he would never sign it. He threatened to tear the contract into pieces and take his chances in bankruptcy court, rather than hand his family legacy over to a peasant. He actually gripped the thick stack of papers, preparing to rip them. I didn't stop him. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. A cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. I leaned back in the chairman's chair. I told him to go ahead. I told him to rip it up. I calmly checked the simple stainless steel watch on my wrist. I announced the time, 9:15 in the morning. I looked back at Harrison and explained the reality of his situation very clearly. I told him that if he tore up that contract at exactly 10 o'clock, the bank would officially declare Vance Marine Transport in default. They would immediately freeze every single operating account. The Port Authority would seize his entire fleet of cargo ships by noon, and because he had so foolishly used his personal assets as collateral to secure the last desperate loan, the bank would foreclose on his massive cliffside estate by the end of the week. I let that sink in. The mansion, the cars, the country club memberships, all gone. But I wasn't finished. I leaned forward again, locking eyes with him. I added the final nail to the coffin. I casually mentioned that if he didn't sign, Desmond would immediately walk out of this building, drive straight to the federal prosecutor's office, and hand over the secondary hidden ledger proving millions of dollars in corporate fraud. I told Harrison he would not just be bankrupt. He would spend the rest of his twilight years wearing a jumpsuit that didn't match his custom-tailored tastes. I pointed a single finger at the signature line on the contract. I told him he had exactly 2 choices: sign the paper, walk away with nothing but his freedom and a tiny, heavily restricted retirement stipend, and let me save the company and the workers, or tear it up and watch his entire family burn to the ground on the front page of the national news. Harrison stared at the paper. He stared at the silver pen resting next to it. He looked at Julian, who was silently crying, actual tears of panic streaming down his face. He looked at Desmond, who just nodded grimly. Harrison Vance was completely, utterly broken. The grand illusion of his superiority shattered into a million sharp pieces on the floor. With a hand that shook so badly he could barely hold the pen, Harrison reached down. He did not say another word. The only sound in the room was the scratching of the silver nib against the heavy paper as he signed his name, transferring 100% ownership of the Vance family legacy over to the street rat he had so deeply despised. When he finished, he dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell off the edge. What happens to a family built entirely on money and ego when the money vanishes overnight? The ink on the contract was barely dry before the massive shock wave started hitting the foundation of the Vance family. By noon, Fiona had officially filed the acquisition paperwork with the regulatory commissions. The news broke on the financial networks like a thunderclap. The stock tickers at the bottom of the screens rapidly changed from red to green as the market realized Aegis Holdings had stepped in to save the failing giant. But in the private elite circles, the real story was spreading like wildfire. Harrison Vance had been ousted, completely stripped of his power and his company by an unknown entity. I was sitting in my new office. Harrison's old office, when my personal cell phone started biting up. It wasn't business calls. It was the parasite chain. Gemma had come down to the headquarters to be with me. She was sitting on the leather sofa, her own phone buzzing nonstop. The first call was from Clara, her mother. Gemma put it on speakerphone and set it on the glass coffee table. Clara was completely hysterical. The composed, icy socialite who had forced me to sit at the kids' table was gone. She was sobbing loudly, her voice high and breathless. She screamed through the speaker, demanding to know what Gemma had let me do. She cried that they were ruined, that Harrison's credit cards had just been declined at the country club, and that the bank had called about the mortgage. She tried to use the ultimate weapon of the toxic parent. She wailed that we were family, that blood is thicker than water, and that Gemma needed to make me reverse the deal immediately, or she would be responsible for giving her father a heart attack. Gemma stared at the phone. For 3 years I had watched her flinch at her mother's manipulative tone. But today, something had fundamentally shifted. She did not cry. She did not apologize. Gemma leaned forward, her voice incredibly calm and cold. She told her mother that family is supposed to protect you, not use you as a prop. She reminded Clara of every insult, every sneer, every time they had treated me like garbage. She said clearly and firmly that family is absolutely not a free pass to act like a monster. Then Gemma reached out and tapped the red button. She ended the call. A second later, she blocked the number. Immediately, the phone rang again. This time it was an aunt. Then an uncle. The flying monkeys were swarming. All the wealthy relatives who had happily laughed at Harrison's jokes at my expense were suddenly terrified that the money tap had been shut off. They left frantic voicemails begging Gemma to talk some sense into me, pleading for mercy, insisting that the dinner party was just a silly misunderstanding. Gemma systematically blocked every single one of them. She looked up at me, a massive weight visibly lifting off her shoulders. She was finally free. I gave her a soft smile, then stood up and walked out of the office, down the hall back to the main boardroom. Harrison and Julian were still there. They had not moved. They looked like two men waiting for a firing squad. I walked in and stood at the head of the table. It was time for the eviction. I looked at Julian first. He flinched when my eyes met his. I didn't waste time. I told him he was officially terminated, effective immediately, with 0 severance pay. I pulled out a pair of heavy metal scissors from my pocket and demanded his corporate credit card. He handed it over with shaking fingers. I cut it in half right in front of his face and let the plastic pieces fall onto the table. I told him he was no longer welcome on any Vance Marine property, and if he ever tried to log into the corporate network again, my legal team would release the evidence of his embezzlement to the authorities. Julian practically ran out of the room crying. Then I turned to Harrison. The old man looked broken, staring blankly at the wall. I told him the forced liquidation clause was now active. I informed him that his severance package was completely voided due to the fraudulent financial records we had secured. He was walking away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the house he was about to lose to the bank. Harrison looked up at me, his eyes red and hollow. He whispered that I had destroyed his life. I leaned down, resting my hands on the table, getting right in his face. I told him, I didn't destroy your life. Your own arrogance did. I just handed you the bill. I checked my watch. I told him he had exactly 30 minutes to pack any personal non-corporate items from his office. I told him my security team would be escorting him out. As he slowly pushed his chair back to stand up, I added one final instruction. I pointed toward the hallway. I told Harrison that when he left the building, he was not to use the executive elevator in the main lobby. I told him to take the service elevator in the back alley. I looked him dead in the eye and used his own philosophy against him. I said that the main lobby was reserved strictly for employees who actually provided value to the company. I watched him walk out of the boardroom, his shoulders slumped, his legacy gone. The peasant had just evicted the king. The next morning, long before the sun had even thought about rising over the city skyline, the air was freezing and thick with the heavy scent of salt water and diesel fuel. It was exactly 5 in the morning. The massive floodlights of the southern shipping port cut through the dense coastal fog. I was not in the penthouse boardroom. I was standing on the concrete docks wearing my old heavy canvas jacket, the same one I used to wear when I unloaded crates on these exact same piers almost a decade ago. Desmond stood beside me holding a steaming cup of awful gas station coffee. He was officially the new acting CEO of Vance Marine Transport, though we were already filing the paperwork to rebrand the company completely. The Vance name was poison, and it was time to scrub it from the hulls of the ships. A group of about 30 men and women were gathered around us in a loose semicircle. They were the shift foremen, the crane operators, the logistical managers. These were the people with dirt beneath their fingernails, the ones who actually kept the massive gears of the industry turning, while men like Harrison Vance drank champagne in glass towers. They looked tired, cautious, and deeply suspicious of the sudden corporate takeover they had read about in the midnight news alerts. I stepped forward onto a wooden shipping pallet so they could hear me over the loud, rhythmic hum of the massive container ships. I didn't give them a slick corporate speech. I didn't use words like synergy or paradigm shift. I looked at their faces, weathered by the wind and the work. I introduced myself. I told them I knew exactly how hard they worked, because I used to break my back on this very dock. I told them I knew Harrison Vance had treated them like disposable numbers on a spreadsheet. Then I delivered the only news that actually mattered to them. I announced that as of midnight last night, the massive cuts to their pension funds had been fully reversed. The stolen money was being injected back into their retirement accounts, fully funded by the immediate liquidation of the former executive board's bloated luxury assets. I promised them that we were bringing in new predictive software that would make their shifts safer and more efficient, but that no human jobs would be cut. For a second, there was total silence. They were waiting for the catch. When they realized there was no catch, a low murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, quickly turning into loud, genuine cheers. A massive, burly foreman in a high-visibility vest stepped forward and shook my hand, his grip like a steel vise. He just nodded and said, "Welcome back to the docks, boss." That was the moment it all felt real. I had not just destroyed a toxic family, I had protected the people who actually mattered. Fast forward to that evening. The chaos of the takeover was finally beginning to settle. The media frenzy was dying down, and the reality of the new order was taking hold. Gemma and I didn't celebrate by going to a 5-star restaurant. We didn't buy expensive champagne or throw a lavish party to show off our new wealth. Instead, we drove my old reliable sedan down to a quiet, elevated overlook near the edge of the harbor. We bought a cheap, greasy pepperoni pizza from a corner shop and sat side by side on the hood of the car. The night air was cruel, but we were wrapped in a thick blanket. We sat in comfortable silence, eating pizza out of the cardboard box, and looked out over the massive, sprawling expanse of the shipping port below. Thousands of lights twinkled across the water. The massive container ships moved slowly, guided by the very software I had built in a tiny, freezing apartment years ago. I looked at Gemma. She was smiling, a real, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. The heavy, anxious shadow that had always hung over her whenever her family was involved was completely gone. She looked lighter. She looked free. I took a bite of my pizza and leaned back against the windshield. I realized then that the true value of a person has absolutely nothing to do with their bloodline, their inheritance, or the designer label on their jacket. True value is measured by what you can build from the absolute ruins, and how tightly you hold on to the people who stood by you when you had nothing. Revenge might be a dish best served cold, but justice tastes exactly like cheap pizza on the hood of a car with the woman you love, watching the empire you built run perfectly without the parasites. Many on the board said I was too cruel to kick my future father-in-law out penniless, completely destroying his family's legacy. What do you think? Was this revenge a fitting justice for the arrogant, or did I cross the line of cruelty? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.